CEO followed his employee home after she asked for leftover food. What he saw that night changed everything. Michael Reynolds had read thousands of employee requests over the years. Most were routine schedule adjustments, payroll clarifications, time-off requests. But tonight, as he sat in his quiet office long after the last board member had left, one request caught his eye. It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't even a demand. It was simple, almost too simple. Would it be possible to take home any leftover meals after my shift? Michael frowned. The name attached to the request was Sophia Carter. A line cook, had been with the company for a little over a year. No complaints, no absences, always clocked in on time, always clocked out last, but something about this message sat differently with him. Most employees didn't formally request leftover food if they wanted extra. They usually just asked a manager in person or grabbed something quietly. Why did she feel the need to ask officially in writing? Michael wasn't the type to get sentimental over employee concerns. He was a CEO. After all, his job was to keep the company running, not get involved in personal matters, but this stuck with him. He typed her name into the system, pulling up her profile, 24 years old, no spouse, no emergency contacts listed. That was odd. He leaned back in his chair. Maybe she was just frugal. Maybe she didn't want to spend money on food if she didn't have to. A lot of employees struggled even in a well-paying company like his, but there was something in the way she phrased it that made it seem like she wasn't just trying to save money. She needed that food. And for the first time in a long time, Michael felt a pull of curiosity. He couldn't shake. He glanced at the 10:47 p.m. Sophia's shift ended at 11 p.m. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat, shut down his laptop, and headed toward the back exit of the building. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Not really, but he knew one thing tonight he was going to find out. Michael had no idea that what he was about to see would change everything. Michael stepped outside into the cool night air, adjusting the collar of his coat. The parking lot was mostly empty now, except for a few late-night workers finishing their shifts across the lot. Through the kitchen's back door, he spotted Sophia. She was wiping down the last of the counters, her dark brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail strands clinging to her forehead from the long hours under the heat of the grills. She moved quickly, methodically, like someone who had done this 1,000 times before. A manager passed by, handing her a brown paper bag. She thanked him with a small nod and tucked it under her arm. That must have been the food she requested. Michael watched as she untied her apron, folded it neatly, and grabbed her worn-out backpack from a hook. Then, without hesitation, she stepped out into the night, making her way toward the bus stop down the street. Michael hesitated. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but standing here watching one of his employees leave after a grueling double shift, he felt strange, disconnected. He had spent years at the top, private cars, first-class flights, executive lounges, the idea of taking the bus after working 16 hours on your feet. He had never once experienced it, and that thought alone was enough to push him forward. Michael climbed into his black sedan, but didn't turn on the engine right away. He waited. Sophia stood under the flickering streetlight, arms crossed, shifting from foot to foot. The bus was late. Finally, headlights appeared in the distance, and she stepped onto the bus, barely looking up. Michael tailed behind, careful to keep his distance. He didn't know exactly why he was doing this, just that something in his gut told him he had to. The bus ride was longer than Michael anticipated. At every stop, he expected her to get off, but she didn't. The further they went, the more unfamiliar the streets became. Streetlights grew sparer, storefronts turned into boarded-up buildings. The city's skyline disappeared in the rearview mirror, replaced by run-down houses, chain-link fences, and forgotten lots. Michael checked the time, 12:22 a.m. After nearly an hour, Sophia finally pulled the yellow cord signaling her stop. Michael kept his distance, parking at the far end of the street. She walked with purpose, never slowing down, never looking around. It wasn't a bad neighborhood, but it wasn't the kind of place you wanted to be alone at night either. Then she turned a corner and disappeared behind a row of parked cars. Michael exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel. He hadn't even realized he was holding his breath. He pulled forward slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might draw attention. Then he saw it. Not an apartment, not even a small house. A trailer. Sophia stepped up to the door, balancing the paper bag in one hand as she carefully unlocked it inside. A dim light flickered on, casting shadows against the thin curtains. Michael sat in stunned silence. This wasn't what he expected. This wasn't what he expected at all. But what he saw next made his stomach turn. Michael parked a short distance away, just far enough to observe without being seen. His heartbeat was steady, but his hands felt unusually tight against the steering wheel. Why was she living here? Sophia had worked for his company for over a year. He didn't know her salary off the top of his head, but it wasn't minimum wage. She wasn't a teenager working part-time. She was full-time, working double shifts that should have been enough to afford at least a small apartment, shouldn't it? But here she was, stepping inside a trailer that looked barely held together, the kind of place people lived in when they had no other options. Michael leaned forward slightly, watching inside. The weak glow from a single overhead light revealed a cramped, cluttered interior. The walls was stained, the carpet thin and worn down. There were no decorations, no signs of luxury, just survival, then movement. 3 small figures emerged from the shadows. Children. Sophia barely had time to set the bag down before they rushed, her arms wrapping around her waist. She laughed softly, her exhaustion momentarily replaced by something warmer. Michael swallowed hard. They weren't her kids. They were too young for that. Siblings. Maybe then an older woman, frail and slow-moving, stepped into view. Her hair was streaked with gray, her shoulders hunched. A grandmother? Sophia gently helped her into a chair, speaking softly, her hand resting briefly on the woman's shoulder. Before she turned back to the paper bag on the counter, Michael watched as she why unpack the food, dividing it onto 4 plates, not 5. The kids dug in first, eating quickly, as if they were used to meals being small and uncertain. The grandmother ate slower, her hands unsteady as she lifted the fork to her lips. Sophia, she sat, but she didn't touch her plate. Michael's jaw clenched. She wasn't eating. She was pretending, cutting the food into smaller pieces, moving it around with her fork, smiling and nodding when the kids spoke, but never once taking a bite. She was giving up her own meal to make sure they had enough. Michael's chest tightened. He had come here expecting what he wasn't sure, maybe just to confirm that she needed the food, maybe to satisfy some vague curiosity, but this was sacrifice, and it made his stomach twist in a way he wasn't prepared for. He thought about his own dinner that night, a perfectly plated steak at a high-end restaurant, a bill that cost more than Sophia probably made in 2 days. He hadn't even finished it, and yet here she was sitting in a trailer after working a 16-hour shift pretending to eat so her family wouldn't worry about her. Michael exhaled slowly, staring at the scene before him. This wasn't just an employee struggling to make ends meet. This was a broken system, and he was a part of it. But what he didn't know was that Sophia's story was even worse than it seemed. Michael sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. The quiet hum of the street around him felt distant, almost muted against the weight of what he was witnessing. Sophia smiled as she listened to the kids talk between bites, her tired eyes soft with affection. She looked happy, or at least she was trying to be, but Michael could see the truth in the way she rubbed her temples when no one was looking, the way her shoulders sagged when she thought no one was paying attention. Then the oldest child, a boy, maybe 10 or 11, said something that made Michael's chest tighten even more. "Did you eat at work today?" Michael watched Sophia's reaction carefully for a split second, just a fraction of a moment. Her face changed not much, just the tiniest flicker of hesitation before she forced that same tired smile and lied. "Yeah, I had something earlier." The boy stared at her unconvinced, but he didn't push. He just nodded slowly and went back to his food. Michael felt sick. She wasn't just skipping dinner tonight. This was a pattern. She had likely been doing this for weeks, maybe months, and yet she still got up every morning, went to work, stayed late, and came home with just enough to make sure her family didn't go hungry, even if that meant she did. Michael leaned back in his seat, exhaling sharply. This wasn't just unfair, this was unacceptable, and the worst part he had never even noticed inside the trailer. Sophia finally stood up. Gathering the empty plates, the kids let out tired yawns, stretching as they made their way toward a small, sectioned-off fare in the back. The grandmother moved slower, shuffling toward what looked like a recliner instead of a bed. Michael squinted. That couldn't be right. The trailer was small, too small. There was no extra space, no second bedroom. He did a quick count in his head. 4 people, 1 room. Then he saw it. A thin mattress, barely more than a cushion, tucked into the corner near the kitchen. A single blanket neatly folded at the edge. Michael swallowed hard. That was Sophia's bed. Not a bedroom, not even a couch. Just a thin mattress on the floor after working double shifts, after standing for hours in front of a hot grill, after spending all day serving meals to strangers. This is where she laid her head at night. Michael had seen enough. He ran a business that prided itself on being family-oriented. He sat in meetings where executives talked about employee satisfaction and fair wages, and yet here was one of his hardest-working employees, homeless, starving, sacrificing everything for her family, all while he sat in an office so large it had its own espresso machine and leather chairs worth more than this entire trailer. He thought about the company perks, bonuses, retreats, corporate dinners, the wasted food thrown away at the end of every shift, food that could have fed people like Sophia. Michael closed his eyes for a second, breathing through the anger rising in his chest. This wasn't right. And for the first time in a long time, he knew that simply feeling bad about it wasn't enough. Michael had to do something, and he had to do it now. Michael didn't go home that night. He couldn't. Instead, he sat in his car, staring at the trailer long after the lights inside flickered off. His mind was racing. How had he missed this? How many other employees were just like Sophia, silently struggling, showing up to work with smiles while their stomachs were empty? He thought about the corporate budget, the salaries of his executives, the thousands of dollars spent on marketing campaigns every month. And then he thought about Sophia's mattress on the floor. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. This wasn't a personal failure, this was a company failure, and he was at the top of it for years. He had told himself that his employees were well taken care of. He had read reports, approved payroll structures, signed off on policies, but he had never really looked tonight. He had looked, and now he couldn't ignore it. Michael picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He didn't hesitate before pressing. Call it rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Sir, it's past midnight. Everything okay?" It was his head of operations, the same person responsible for overseeing the company's employee programs. "No." Michael said, his voice firm. "Everything is not okay." There was a pause on the other end. "What do you mean?" Michael glanced at the trailer one last time before turning the key in the ignition. "We need to fix this, all of it." First thing in the morning, he didn't wait for a response. He hung up because this wasn't a discussion, this was a decision, and Michael was just getting started the next morning. Michael walked into the office with one goal in mind: change by noon. Policies were already being rewritten. Leftover food, no longer optional for employees. Now it would be packaged and distributed daily to workers who needed it, wages reevaluated and adjusted, ensuring that no full-time employee would never have to choose between rent and food again, emergency assistance. A new program launched, providing financial aid for employees facing hardships, and Sophia. She walked into work the next day like nothing had changed until her manager pulled her aside and handed her an envelope. Inside was a significant raise, enough to move her family into an apartment, enough to let her eat without guilt, enough to give her the security she'd been fighting for all this time. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't have to pretend to be okay. Michael had come to work that morning as a CEO. He left as a leader. How many people around us are struggling in silence? How often do we look the other way? If you have the power to help, even in the smallest way, don't wait. Do something today.